Hey everybody, VD15 here and welcome back to my game development series. In the last episode we implemented the core gameplay features of our tower defense game, making it technically playable. Since then I've replaced all of the placeholder assets I was using, redid the UI and implemented resource management into the game. I'm much more happy with the assets that I'm using now, although I'm lacking an animated player. I want the color palette to be largely dominated by two colors. I've chosen teal and orange, but I can change this at any point. I'm using color multiplication to apply color to textures at runtime, and I plan to have the colors in use randomized at the beginning of every game, although it would be kind of pointless to implement this now. The user interface has also been redone, sporting displays for both resources and current wave number. What's also different from last time is the text rendering for these components is completely dynamic, meaning that I can make them say pretty much whatever I want and have the panel behind them still fit. There's also a hotbar showing what towers the player has equipped, although there's only one tower in the game right now, so it's somewhat redundant. The act of placing and selling towers is also different. Instead of instantly appearing and disappearing when a button is pressed, a dialog is brought up and the player can then select where they want the tower to be placed using the mouse. If they have enough resources, they can then place one by left-clicking or cancel by right-clicking. Selling towers works similarly and refunds 80% of the resources that were spent constructing it. Upgrading towers will also work the same way when it's implemented. Something that was on the to-do list for this month is also the first goal that I failed to meet, that is proper enemy pathfinding. I decided on postponing this feature because I was not only reworking the way that map tiles are represented in-game, but I'm also in the process of reworking how enemies are handled in preparation for future gameplay additions. I want to get everything working off a prototyping system. This would allow me to create a bunch of templates for things like enemies and towers without having to code a separate entity for a minor statistic change. Towers and projectiles are already working off this system, but players and enemies aren't, and I want to make the transition before adding more enemies or changing the existing ones. Now, before I move on to what's new this episode, I want to address some loose ends from last time. First is how the enemies and players are going to interact with the map. I've made the decision that enemies will follow a predetermined path towards the objective that the player will have limited influence over. The paths will have to be at least 3 tiles wide at all times to allow the player to maneuver around the enemies effectively without constantly getting stuck on corners. Because of this choice, I will need to make some changes to the tower's targeting AI, as they tend to miss enemies that are more than 1 tile away. Then there's the issue of the name of the game. Last episode I was sitting on the name Defensive Offensive, but I was hesitant to finalize it on account of the fact that that's a bad name. Since then I've decided on the name Diode instead. It's a lot shorter, I feel it fits the style of the game better, and as of recording there isn't anything on Steam with a similar name. With all that out of the way, what are we going to do next? First, I want to get enemies and players operating on the prototyping system that I mentioned earlier. This is already underway and it shouldn't take too long, so I'm putting this right at the beginning of the list. Most of the goals that I initially set out for September involved adding more enemy, weapon, and tower varieties to the game, and I think that's certainly a good idea to focus on for the remainder of this month. This will also be a good excuse for me to add some sort of loadout screen to the game. I also think it would be beneficial to rework the test map that I have in place to be more reflective of how the final game is going to play. Right now it's just a big square that doesn't reflect any of the decisions we made regarding the scale and layout of the maps. The test map doesn't have to be something worthy of the final release, but it should be something that I can test almost every gameplay feature in. I also want to take this opportunity to implement decorative tiles to some extent, as well as tweaking map loading to allow for connected tile textures. Since I'm going to be expanding on the combat system this month, I think it would be a good idea to look at how other games' combat systems play and then decide how I want mine to play. In order to examine this, I'm going to be looking at 4 prominent tower defense games, how they treat enemy health, how they go about utilizing multiple types of enemy, and how various towers synergize with each other. The games I'm going to be looking at today are Bloons, Plants vs Zombies, Sanctum, and Dungeon Defenders. Let's start with Bloons. Bloons indicates the health of its enemies by changing the color and size of the balloon, with 1 hit point being equivalent to 1 layer of balloon. Upgrading towers is a balancing act between shooting multiple targets and popping multiple layers. Upgrading too much in either direction can leave you vulnerable to either a swarm of weak enemies or a few very strong ones. There are a lot of upgrade choices in Bloons, with each tower having 3 separate paths to choose from, many of which can change the way that the tower operates and allows them to specialize to certain builds. Some enemies can be a bit unfair in my opinion. The lead and camouflage balloons can only be popped by certain towers, and there's little indication that they're coming a few waves in advance. I've never really been a fan of requiring a hard counter to an enemy because I believe it stifles how creative a player can be with their builds. While Bloons can skirt around this issue a bit, as it gives you several options to counter these enemies with, I'm still not a fan of the philosophy behind the decision. Moving on to Plants vs Zombies, the game takes a similar approach to Bloons, where the health of the enemy is dictated by how it looks. Every enemy has several distinct states depending on their health, so the exact value is never revealed to the player, but they have a good enough idea of whereabouts it is. There's very little tower synergy in this game, however. The only example I can think of is the Torchwood doubling the damage of pea shooters. Upgrading is pretty much non-existent, however there are some endgame plants that act as upgrades, and many can completely change how a plant functions, although they're not a big part of the core gameplay. Enemies that require hard counters do exist in the form of the Bungee, Balloon, Pogo, and Digger zombies, though they're not too bad as the game always tells the player what's coming when they're choosing their plants. Most enemies are some variation of a basic zombie with varying speed and health, and some have the means to circumvent various defenses. Plants vs Zombies combat system is about playing to counter the threat that you're faced with. This is most strongly demonstrated during the campaign, where you're frequently introduced to a new plant, followed by an enemy that is weak to said plants. The campaign is short and varied enough for this not to get repetitive, and all of the towers in the game have some unique personality and charm to them. Moving on to Sanctum now, the game takes a different approach to the games covered previously, as the health values for enemies are all made apparent by health bars and damage flashes. Enemies have no indication of how damaged they are outside of their health bar, and the only noticeable change is how they ragdoll when they're out of health. Enemies have diverse and recognizable body types, and each are weak to different types of build. Tower synergy is present but limited, and most of the strategy revolves around constructing mazes to take advantage of how a tower operates. Players can adjust their build according to the next incoming wave, and have to strike a balance in between upgrading their towers and their own arsenal. Upgrading towers, and indeed player weapons in Sanctum, is just a simple stat boost, and doesn't change how anything operates. Players also don't take damage, instead they just get knocked around a bunch. The only real threat that the enemy poses to the player directly is by knocking them off the map and forcing them to respawn. A somewhat unique feature in Sanctum is weak point damage. Enemies take increased damage from some parts of their body, usually the bit that's glowing orange. This is mostly a feature that allows players to rack up some extra damage, but some enemies can only take damage from their weak spot, which makes many towers useless against them because you can't control where on the enemy they hit. Something that I believe is of note in Sanctum is the health of the objective. Instead of having lives, like in Balloons, or being instant death, like in Plants vs Zombies, the health of the objective goes down in amount according to what enemy hit it. I like this because it means that a few stragglers from a barrage of weak enemies can't completely decimate your playthrough like a boss can. Not only is this fairer on the players in my opinion, but it also makes sense. This is definitely something that I want to borrow. Finally, let's have a look at Dungeon Defenders. Similar to Sanctum, health and damage values are made visible to the player. Bosses receive a huge health bar at the top of the screen, but only the one health bar, which makes things a bit confusing when there's more than one boss alive at a time. Tower synergy is strong with this one due to the game's elemental combo system, where chaining together multiple types of damage can inflict enemies with powerful status effects. Upgrading towers happens in several ways. There's the usual type of upgrading you would expect, but the most impact happens in between games with the game's loot system. As you play, various types of loot will drop that can be used to upgrade your player character and your towers. Some of this loot can be equipped to towers to give them a significant stat boost beyond what you can achieve by just upgrading. Other forms of loot give your towers special properties such as increased range or better effectiveness against certain enemies. The latter form can completely change how certain towers are used in a build. Much like those before it, the game's not immune to enemies that require hard counters, although each lane gets a nifty little table showing exactly what enemies are coming through, so it's easy to build to counter them. In addition, some of the loot mentioned previously can actually hard counter some of these hard counters, so I guess it balances out. So what can we take away from this? Games portray health either by enemy visuals or numbers in health bars. I'm already going for a relatively minimalist visual style, and I think that enemies in varying states of decay would dirty the geometric look that I'm trying to achieve. I've toyed around with enemies getting smaller as they lose health, but I found that this only makes them harder to see as a result, which isn't good when they're getting close to the objective. I lean more towards health bars when it comes to this issue, plus I already went through the trouble of implementing dynamic text rendering, so I might as well put it to good use with damage flashes. I don't want enemies to be outright immune to certain types of damage, but at the same time I want to encourage players to diversify the towers they're using. I think a good solution to this is soft counters. For example, some enemies take a 50% damage reduction from certain sources. I hope that this will encourage players to diversify without making them feel like they're being forced to do so. On the note of tower diversity, I feel a good way to bring this on is by having towers synergize with each other well. Dungeon Defender's elemental combo system works great for this, and I want to implement something similar in my game. Upgrading towers and balloons can completely change their behavior as well as their stats. I certainly like this idea, and I think it could allow towers to synergize better, especially when combined with the combo system idea. However, I want to simplify it, as some of the upgrade paths and balloons add needless complexity to a tower's use. I'd like a two-part system, similar to that of Dungeon Defenders, where a tower's behavior is determined by some form of equipment and upgraded normally in-game, though exactly what this equipment does and how you get it is for another episode. So to recap, the goals for next month include finishing the rework of enemies and players, adding more enemies, towers and weapons, adding a loadout screen, reworking the test map, reworking map loading to look better, and adding proper enemy pathing. We're slightly less ahead of schedule than we were last episode, but we're still ahead and that's what's important. The game's come together a lot just over the past month and I'm really happy with how it's shaping up visually, but everything hinges on whether I can make it fun. If you want to keep up to date with the development of Diodes, then be sure to subscribe to this channel. I'll be posting regular update videos like this one where I talk about where development is and the direction it's heading in. If you'd like to follow me outside of YouTube, I have various forms of social media linked in the description where you can talk to me directly. Other than that, I'm VD15 and I'll see you next time.